Hello, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us again for our COVID update webinar. It's been another interesting week around COVID and lockdown, as we've had the easing of restrictions or not, depending on how you interpret it. So within the NHS, lots of discussion around thoughts turning towards a potential second wave. How are the public going to respond to the easing of lockdown? And a lot of thoughts again about how and when services might resume. There's a growing backlog of patients that needs to be seen, possibly not the infrastructure there to quite see them yet. So hugely interesting and controversial topics. This week, I'm sure will be incredibly valuable for everyone logging in, given our audience. We're looking at a really important part of the NHS for everyone within our audience, which is strategic procurement and medicines management. We are joined by one. We're having slight technical difficulties with our second guest at the moment, but two of the most qualified people in the country probably to talk about this area. We are waiting for Keith Pearson to join us. Who is
sorry, Tom? I'm on the phone now. Tom, can you hear me?
Yes, we've got.
Yeah, sorry, I've had to log in via phone. It's my computer's not playing up today, so I'm here. I'm joining in on via my phone.
That was fantastic timing, Keith. Just as I mentioned your name, you joined in. So
I did catch that. I did catch that one. So thanks for that intro.
No problem. We've also got Simon Wootton, who is former Chief Officer of Heywood, Middleton and Rochdale CCG, amongst other roles within the NHS, and his current NHS role is working as a non-exec director of Rossendale West PCN. So again, enough of me talking probably. We will go straight into a discussion with Simon and Keith. So Simon, prior to COVID, there's been lots of work around strategic procurement within the NHS. Could you just give us a little comment on how this crisis has impacted thinking around procurement and supply chain?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Tom. Yeah, I suppose the initial big thing I would say is that COVID-19 has clearly underscored the weaknesses in the supply chains and procurement, full stop. I mean, that's very clear. And what's probably most frustrating is that given all the build up to Brexit, whether we wanted it or not, we should have been better prepared. We should have had 3 months stocks in warehouses across the country sorted. So what appears to be all that big bluff about Brexit preparation has actually not happened to the full extent. What's fascinating over the last few weeks and months is that hospitals have been blocked from ordering critical care equipment via normal channels because of exceptional increase in national demand. The NHS supply chain has issued suspension notices for 13 non-invasive ventilator masks, and 57 tracheostomy tubes and kits mean they can't be ordered from the traditional tower catalogues that exist. NHS supply chain is now put in place what's called clinical consumable group leads. So basically, supplies are now being pushed through an excessive number of channels, including a central push to deliveries, business as usual NHS supply chain orders, an emergency PPE hotline, and direct sourcing. So it's almost as if the government respond differently to each service demands as it comes up in Parliament. And also there's separate supply chains for care homes now. So you've got this myriad of supply chains certainly for the PPE equipment, and it plays for medicines as well. And local authorities are going out to get their own PPE supplies. If you look at Bradford Council recently chartered a plane to go off to China to get them, fly out to get it. So we've got a real mix of channels. And it's basically that there's examples now of local systems emerging, doing their own things. So Greater Manchester, where I used to work, has got its own central procurement hub and its own factory starting making PPE equipment. And I don't know if you've seen today, but the government have announced a contract with Honeywell up in Scotland to start producing PPE masks, 4.5 million a month from July. So that will generate 450 jobs for the Scottish area, which is fantastic, and probably something I'll cover later on, but it's about regenerating the economy we all need to do. And it's very clear that NHS Trust were very unhappy with supply chain anyway before COVID, in terms of the towers and having to pay a margin and not seeing any data from that and getting any benefit. So this only makes it worse. And it's actually, given the limitations on supplies out there, it's how the NHS will, the letters come out from NHS today about restarting electives again, and people needing to do 2 weeks test before their surgery happens. But how they're going to do that without the equipment, I don't know, to be honest. Limitations on supplies is going to be a real problem. So yes, there's I think a real need to review the supply and procurement chains. Whilst it's been talked about before new systems in place, what they've been is tested before they're fully bedded down.
Fantastic, thank you. So you mentioned that bit around some sort of the blocking of procurement locally and kind of the local versus national tensions. Has that been in sort of COVID specific procurement areas, or is it broader than that?
It's been mainly COVID specific, but there are areas in different parts of the country. Well, it seems when politicians get involved, they seem to be able to secure things. When the NHS does, it doesn't. So the NHS is, seen as a national system, and what they're doing currently is putting a national, focus on that. And that historical element is of the Lord Carter review. That was very much things once across the NHS to get the economies out. So I can understand that, but yes, there's definitely more a push to do things once nationally, because there are parts in the country where there's more of one thing than other parts. So again, it's trying to make that equal distribution where people need it. But yes, it's not just PPE, it is medicines and things like that, which people talk about shortly. But yeah, there's a real imbalance now on that.
Yeah,
okay. And there's more drugs that are being shown in short supply, reported on a weekly basis now. SSRIs and things like that again affected.
Yeah, okay. Has there been any local input into any of these decisions, or have the decisions all been taken at kind of NHSE or government level?
NHSE and government level is the predominant one. So much as trust procurement people will moan and raise concerns, and the provider network does, the only areas that have done anything is where they're devolved. So Greater Manchester, down in Surrey and other parts, and Dorset are doing their own things because they've been released from the power of national to do that and have the authority to do it. So yeah, and obviously the councils are another one. A good example of care homes, they're getting off Bradford doing its own thing because councils aren't controlled nationally in the same way. The way they've got the freedom, they're doing it, and where they haven't, they can't. They're controlled by the national umbrella.
Yeah, okay, and that's a really interesting point about the sort of the devolution of power, because obviously the ICS agenda has been accelerated. 4 more have been announced in the last week or so.
Yes.
Is that likely? Well, we're going to look ahead in a while, but in terms of the additional powers that you have as a devolved part of the country over procurement, what particular areas are they able to exercise more power over?
Well, I think, Greater Manchester is a good example. Because of the power of having 10 local authorities, they've got a big enough presence economically to make a difference. So it attracts businesses to them. And obviously then they've got, because of the devolved powers, they've got the budget given locally to do it. So again, you can set up your own manufacturing site, for gloves and things like that, which is happening in Greater Manchester, and also have the sufficient buying power to work with places like China in its own right. So I think that if you've got it's the size of the system that's important.
Okay.
So the NHS should be big enough to do it on its own, because it's the biggest market of anywhere for health in England, compared to anywhere else. So we're not maximising that effect. But yeah, certainly where you've got the power locally, you should use it. Yeah.
Brilliant, fantastic. Thank you, Simon. So Keith, I'm hoping you can still hear me.
Yeah, can still hear you.
Your role is all about commissioning medicines and sort of looking at the supply of medicines to the system that you're working in. So within your role, what have been the main impacts of COVID on how you're able to do your job?
Okay, so it's going to sound like a kind of series of unfortunate events, to quote a phrase. But when we first were aware of this, the populace tended to panic, almost like Aldi's and Tesco's and Sainsbury's were all overwhelmed. Well, GPs were largely overwhelmed with the hugely increased demands for prescriptions. In addition, you probably heard that they also went on shopping sprees, buying up any paracetamol or ibuprofen that happened to be on any shelf anywhere. I don't know what they were planning to do with it, but the supplies dwindled very, very quickly. So we'd given very clear instructions not to increase the volumes of prescribing, but it clearly didn't make any difference. And we got to the backlog, which obviously there's a throughput that you can get for your prescription dispense through community pharmacy. And at the height of the sort of panic situation, we were on a 5 days backlog. So basically you took it in on Monday morning. You were extremely lucky to get your prescription by Friday afternoon. Huge volumes of increase. Now, I can only presume what those might have been due to. Everybody who'd ever had any medicine any time since the patient was 2.5 seemed to be requested by patients. even if there was no justification for it. And some of those obviously clearly went out. So what did this result in? Inevitable stock depletion. Not just some lines, but a significant number of lines went down. All sorts of important medicines which had previously been there were no longer aware. So in addition, the impact on surgeries who needed any form of patients requiring blood tests, blood monitoring was considerable, in that they weren't actually going to be able to come in. And what did that look like if we were going to extend the frequency of monitoring into kind of uncharted territory? So we had to work through that down. So we mentioned some inhalers were out of stock, and we were promised that this would be quickly resolved, but there may have been some marginal changes in stock positions, but it didn't kind of get to where we wanted it to be. So we're now 6 weeks into the sort of post-lockdown period, and sort of things have calmed down a little bit. We're still aware of sporadic issues with patients unable to get certain medicines. We were already aware of some of these post-Brexit discussions, and as Simon says, some of the things which maybe should have been put in place to address these wasn't actually put in place. This has had an impact in many drug prices. You'll be aware of, there's a category of medicines called no cheaper stock obtainable, and that tends to pick up market fluctuations in supply and demand. If there's more demand than supply, often the price increases, and that's something we're having to factor in at the moment. So, and the other thing that kind of patients who are a bit internet savvy, we're often trying to sort of pick up on maybe some of Donald Trump's words, or sort of gossip that was going around on the internet and social media. One of the potential sort of cures or preventatives it was being talked about was azithromycin and hydroxychloroquine. We do know that this is a lot of credibility giving to this combination, but without the evidence to support it. And we tried to avoid this being prescribed without good clinical evidence. We don't know if it actually was, but we now know that the potential effects on the QT interval, cardiac QT interval, was considerable, and so potentially this combination, had it been prescribed, could have been quite dangerous for some patients.
Yeah, fantastic. And just in terms of, obviously you've seen these trends around, you know, the panic buying, for want of a better phrase. In terms of the data that you've actually got, how well do you understand the picture at the moment? Have you got clarity over exactly what?
Financially, we understand it very well. We, in the first month of kind of lockdown, I'm taking that roughly about March, it cost us another £600,000 on medicines. So, you know, a significant demand increase, which we can put down to no other plausible explanation other than COVID. You know, just as people went out and bought 200 toilet rolls, well, unless they had, you know, 2 years' supplies of inhalers, perhaps they weren't happy. So in a way, the panic was not just about consumables; it was also extended into the fields of medicine as well.
Yeah, fantastic. And just to give us an idea, that £600,000 that you talked about, the additional spend, what, as a percentage of the normal spend, what would that?
It's about an extra 25%.
Okay, so that's really quite significant if that's a national trend.
Huge, yeah.
Huge
impact, and I speak to colleagues locally fairly frequently, and all of them are reporting similar kind of patterns emerging.
And all in similar sort of medicines areas, or is it?
Yeah, these are all medicines related additional expenditure, and all of us have been in the job, you know, quite a while, and we would have all given the same guidance about do's and don'ts, and the message was quite clear from central government: do not increase the number of prescription items that are given out. This will have an impact on the supply chain, and largely we can only assume that the message was just drowned out by the volume of calls coming into surgery for these additional medicines, and in the end, patients won.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that really resonates. Last week we had a session on kind of the front line of pharmacy, and that was really what they've been seeing in community pharmacy and primary care is really just that that overwhelming demand from patients. So really interesting to your perspective. So what do you see, Keith, as the lasting impact of COVID on how medicines are commissioned and how maybe decisions are prioritised?
Well, several things really. Bearing in mind we're kind of medicines are on a global economy, and none of us are, even though we're a fairly big health economy in Greater Manchester, we live within a global economy of medicines, and even now we're trying to make predictions about what's basically an unpredictable. So we haven't even got through the stock shortages. We haven't even got through the true extent of the demand phase. I have a feeling, particularly if we have second or third spikes, that some of the behaviours that we've seen might be replicated 2 and 3 more times, and that could significantly impact on the supply chain. But it's causing immediate problems in that we know that many COVID patients, they die very quickly once they've contracted the disease, and sometimes with pneumonia as well. And so conventional end-of-life medicines are of little use in these patients. And I know of an example where medicines was ordered and it was dispatched in a fairly fast-moving vehicle from the pharmacy, but before it could get there, the patient had actually passed away. So we're talking hours. We're certainly not talking days or weeks here. Some people die in under 4 hours. So we have to have a different approach in accessing the medicines, and even this quite key bunch of end-of-life care medicines, which we recognise could be, very valuable in the patient's last hours of life. Even now, we're aware that there are some stock shortages, and this is arguably one of the key times that we do need to get rid of these type of problems, and we're far from it. Now, we have a reporting system that we collect information from across Greater Manchester, and that's passed upwards. And so, in theory, at least, if medicines are available in other parts of the UK, they could be transported here at relatively short notice. But again, that's only a theory. I'm still seeing day-to-day shortages of some of these medicines. So yeah, we're seeing a kind of the calm again, but is this the calm before the second storm? I really don't know. As Simon has mentioned, politicians want to acquire some medicines. They can do. Hydroxychloroquine is part of a clinical trial now about reducing the harms from COVID. We've not seen much impact on GP prescribing, and we're told they have a stockpile in order to run the trial. So they've acquired them from somewhere, and it's probably true for the other medicines that they're looking at. So in the sort of interim, we're still looking at variable medicine supplies, possibly spikes 2 and 3 to come in the coming months. We really can't predict that. We tried to plan for this one in terms of managing the demand, and it clearly just didn't work. But I'm hoping that in a way this will prompt a government response, as Simon has said, perhaps a revaluation of the value of medicines and the role of medicines in the community. And people like myself who've generally been involved in reducing overall costs, we will actually get some upfront investment money so that we can actually manage people better, because we all know that people are more likely to have a poor outcome from COVID if you have one or more comorbidities, and we can speculate that, and I suspect there will be lots of analysis of the data about the higher risk and how they convey to a risk of a poor outcome with COVID-related complications. But have we done all we could? Well, I think no. We had a process of medicines management, which is about reducing the cost of prescribing. What we arguably need is medicines optimisation, which is, treating the patient the best that we can using the best available medicines, so that we reduce the risks of complications developing in later life, so that if we do get a COVID Mark 2 or 3 or 4 in the years to come, this will impact so that we will lose far fewer people than we've done historically.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. You mentioned in there a couple of times about managing patients better. kind of that medicines optimization piece. Are there any sort of practical things that you've got in mind about what would help you to do that part of your job better?
Well, obviously, optimizing medicines now needs investment. You know, we know that many medicines have got better outcomes data, but invariably always that they're more costly than the ones that we've used hitherto. So if I'm given additional funding, I could probably optimize medicines for a whole lot of people when cost is less of an issue. But when you are fairly frequently tasked with saving another £1 million through efficiency savings, whatever that's meant to be, it's going to be hard to justify medicines optimization, which almost invariably will save costs in the longer term, but you have to invest for now. So we see from the Telegraph the last couple of days that there's going to be a huge demand on paying back all this money we borrowed to manage the COVID epidemic. So are we going to get this investment? Well, answers on a postcard. And if so, are we going to get, you know, a responsible investment that's going to allow us to catch up slightly for the last several years of kind of disinvestment in medicines? Again, I'm not a politician and I don't claim to be, but I think there are some politicians that need to give this kind of answer so that I can do my job to the best of my ability.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting stuff, and I think has really brought into focus the piece about the value of medicines, hasn't it? That if we've got this £300 billion or whatever it ends up being that needs to be repaid, it's not going to be repaid by some efficiency cuts within 12 months. So what's the approach going to be? And I think we're, you know, like you say, that's going to be probably handed to us right from the top of the tree. So it'll be interesting to see how that all develops. Just coming to you now, Simon, kind of picking up on what Keith's really just said there, and kind of in a more general sense, I suppose, do you think the NHS is likely to do much differently regarding procurement as a result of lessons that have been learned?
If it doesn't, there's a problem, I was going to say. I mean, let's go back. Lord Carter report back in 2015 was very clear. You know, use the NHS wants to buy things, is more efficient. And I can't fault that. You know, the bigger negotiating power you have as a bigger body. So yes, but what it's clear, it hasn't worked effectively. What's been happened to date. So they definitely will have to do a full review of that, because we can't be exposed again. And as Keith said, there will be, I'm sure, a second spike and a third spike, given that we're going to part herd immunity effect now, it seems to be, politically, which is probably completely the wrong, like South Korea have done. Then, you know, there's going to be a problem, so we do need to deal with it. But whether the government will respond in time is different, the matter. And I would just back on Keith, the government have committed to putting 36 billion into the NHS, but given what the debt is going to be, I think there'll be a lot of backpedaling on that and more efficiency demands on the health service. So whilst they've written off the hospital debt, CCGs will still have to deliver quip. So there's still going to have to be savings. And as Keith knows, medicines is seen as the easiest way to do it. It's the easiest way to, you know, save money. I think also the fact that we've had problems getting supplies and we need to rebuild the economy, because that's one way to get the economy growing again. There'll have to be serious thinking and support to develop more home-based, you know, grown supplies of medicines and supplies, rather than getting imported from China and places like that. We've got to survive future pandemics, be homegrown, and it's a bit of a, I suppose, a nationalist approach. But we've got to do our own things now, not import them in. I said that Honeywell PPE example that government have announced today is a good example. We're investing in Scotland to do that for us across the UK. So yes, for medicines, I do see a more centralised procurement approach happening. Hopefully, doing more buying from Britain, you know, as an economy to make those medicines. And I think it was Jeremy Corbyn a few years back said about, you know, nationalising pharmaceutical. But we do need the manufacturing of generics in this country as a place, I think, to give us the cover. And certainly, if I was a business, I'd be looking to do that. And it's interesting when, as Keith said, when politicians get involved, we seem to be able to get things. So hydrochloroquine was one, and obviously the recent trial they're doing with the remdesivir down at the Royal Freeman, that was got hold of very quickly. You know, so politicians can have their uses, so we should use that as well. And it does, as I said, make sense for the National Health Service and Lord Carter's report to do it once across the NHS. I suppose the issue is if it doesn't work locally, that's where your problem lies. And as I said before, the NHS is the biggest marketplace for health in England, so we should be maximising that and using that to our effect. So yes, definitely. I suppose in summary, we've got to do a review. We've got to drive the variation and efficiency out of the system, but we've got to have a review of how we've done it and how we can improve on it and grow our own stuff ourselves.
Yeah. Okay. In terms of that homegrown piece, for you, a senior role in the NHS and a commissioning type role, would that be a big, a really important thing for you, knowing that there's a greater availability of supply within this country? Because obviously everything is in focus, even more so because of the global crisis at the moment. If we look 12, 18, 24 months down the line, do you think those themes will still be prevalent, or is it just because of where we are at the moment?
If they're not prevalent, there's a problem. People have very short-term memories. I think COVID-19 will be talked about for years to come. I really do. So I hope. I mean, the other thing that people should be aware, the NHS is a big local employer, so its impact on its local economy is phenomenal. So again, why not get the NHS to do, work with companies to develop that generic marketplace and drugs and things like that to get that self-sufficiency. So yeah, and also, we're trying, great example, invest in the local economy with local suppliers to support ourselves. So the same should go for medicines and supplies generally. We've got to do it. It's the only way we can turn around the economy, I think, in that sense.
Yeah, and I suppose building on that, do you think the NHS is likely to take more in-house, or will it be working with other?
I think that, well, politicians will probably want to work with everyone, won't they? The nature of how our current political model is. But I do think there's a mixture of both in-house and working with partnerships, yes. And let's be honest, if we don't work in partnership, we're short-sighted, because a lot of, to be fair, I've worked with some companies on PPE over this last few months, and I can think of one clinical surgical supplier of treatments who actually was doing no profit on it and actually getting it delivered out. So if people haven't got memories of those good, strong partnership relationships we had, that's a real shame as well. You'd want to build on those partnerships to keep enhancing that, and local, if they're UK businesses particularly, build on that even more and use them more.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's something that we're having lots of conversations with about at the moment, is kind of what partnership means. And I suppose just coming back to you, Keith, quickly, just for a sort of a final word on picking up from Simon there, in terms of the changes and the lessons learned, are there any particular things that you would like to sort of take forward from everything that's been learned from COVID?
Well, clearly the supply chain's fallen over and is still not, fully back to 100%. I understand that, stockpiling of medicines is costly, not to say that, there's a limit. All medicines have a shelf life and expiry date. So we can't just be saying as you buy a 5-year supply and then you just store it in a warehouse in Kent or Coventry or somewhere like that. It can't happen like that. But it has to be that there's a buffer, a cushion built up on a national basis. And we as CCGs are specifically excluded from our ability to stockpile medicines. So if we can't do it, then is anybody going to pick this up, or are we just going to go with it'll be all right on the night, or let's hope for the best? Because it wasn't all right on the night, and we've hoped for the best, and it's been very precarious. And I have no doubt that, and I know from local examples where medicines were not available in the patient's hour of greatest need. Now, that's not a situation I feel proud about, but I don't want it to happen again. But unless somebody listens to the outcomes of this, I think that's exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think we've just about run out of time. So I'd just like to thank you hugely, both of you, for your insight there. Lots of really important, really insightful things that you've given us about, what's changing and how the world might change. So yeah, thanks again to both of you, and to our audience. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at the changing face of care delivery, looking at both kind of system and hospital perspectives, and then primary and community care, and how services are reorganising, some of the things that are actually happening practically to change the way they're delivering care. On June the 5th, we're going to have a special 1-hour session inviting questions in advance to have a panel discussion with some of the experts you've seen over the last few weeks. So please send us in your questions. We'll work through them and try and pick the most common ones out. But for now, thank you very much for joining us again, and we will see you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks.